Wizards lock in. Today we're back with my heads up coach, the legend Kevin Rabichow, as we dive deep into the art of one of the most important spots you always find yourself in, which is 3-bet pot. Kevin's going to help break it down for me and for you to help us understand better on how to think about it. This is part 2 of our series, and I'm looking forward to doing more with him. Lock in. Let's go. Enjoy. All right, let's get into it. We're getting into 3-bet pots, and now we're taking our heads up to the next level. Back with Kevin. Kevin, 3-bet pots. These are where the dreams are made. And it seems like 3-bet pots are a whole other animal than single raise pots, and especially heads up versus 6-max. You're just playing so many more hands, and you really got to learn how to be a true crazy person for heads up 3-bet pots.
Yeah, I mean, like I want to go through the pre-flop ranges a little bit because I know this is where the unfamiliarity for people starts. Is we don't have that like really well-defined, really narrow range that we're normally dealing with when we're playing a bigger 3-bet pot. A lot of players who come from other games, I think they tend to follow certain rules like, I'm looking to bluff when I flop equity. I'm looking at certain board textures like ace high boards or king high boards, and I'm thinking I have a big advantage in these situations. And what ends up happening, if you just look at this range that we're starting with, what ends up happening is people overestimate how strong their range is because they're the person who 3-bet, like they're the pre-flop aggressor, right? This is a very normal way of thinking about pre-flop. But what I end up having to teach a lot of people is that, surprisingly enough, because your range looks like this to begin with, you end up on the flop in a bunch of situations where your range is just kind of average compared to the caller, or even at a disadvantage in certain spots. So, starting just by recognizing that our pre-flop range is pretty wide, it's not that strong, but yes, we do have all the best hands, right? We do have, still the premium hands up here, but we have to be self-conscious about the fact that, you got a whole bunch of suited connectors down here, you got a whole bunch of offsuit bluffs at some frequency, so you can't just go blasting like you might in a tighter range situation.
So can you tell me a little bit about why they decide to split the range like this, and maybe why they leave out hands like A6, A7, kind of like the middle kings, the middle aces, and then like the bottom jacks, and what's the theory behind 10% king 7 and 10% 9-3 and 2-3s in there too? Do you really need to build that strategy, or can you kind of mix and match different hands to put in there instead of queen 4, maybe jack 5, or
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it kind of touches on like my overall philosophy about playing heads up, or even just like playing solver-based strategy in general. Is there's a lot of noise here, and it's certainly purposeful the way that this strategy is built. But if I just change the parameters a little bit, if I change the bet sizing a little bit, if I change my opponent's opening range a little bit, like the stuff is going to move around, right? There's one like key mistake if you're 3-betting out of position. The one key mistake you want to avoid. I actually talked about this in our first video. If y'all haven't watched that already, we did a video covering pre-flop play and single raise pot play in Heads Up No Limit already on this channel. But like the really important thing that you want to make sure you're not doing is you don't want to 3-bet a hand that's going to have to fold away equity facing a 4-bet. So like Heads Up's a very aggressive game. If you 3-bet, you're going to face a 4-bet a reasonable percentage of the time, and you don't want to 3-bet a hand that's going to face that 4-bet and then regret their decision. So all these hands that are kind of in this area right here that you talked about, this area right here that you talked about, these are hands that are not 3-betting that often, because if they face a 4-bet, it's really awkward. If they face a 4-bet, it's a really unfortunate situation. So yes, you don't want to 3-bet like a middle strength hand, right? You want to 3-bet your very good hands, and then you want to 3-bet some kind of playable, kind of reasonable stuff. But do I care if you choose the king 7 at the right frequency versus the king 5 at the right frequency, and avoid the ace 5 and the ace 8? Like, not really. This stuff doesn't matter that much in reality against human players. And I think it's very reasonable to just simplify this down to something that's a little more rounded off, a little more easy to remember. I would often tell my students to do that.
So then let's say your opponent doesn't 4-bet that much, and they maybe are calling more. So they're calling more hands that they should be 4-betting. They basically are 4-betting, which I would assume against a weaker player, this is probably going to be an adjustment they're going to make, is they're not really going to be mixing with the king 4, the king 3, the queen 6, the queen 5, the jack 7, and they might just go more of that top of range for their 4 bets and sort of more face up. So if a player like that comes along, then does that mean that we can 3-bet a lot more and kind of think about it like that? Or, do you not think we should really adjust our strategy?
I mean, I definitely always want to be on the lookout for ways that we can adjust our strategy. So 100%, I like that you're thinking about this. Um, Anytime that I anticipate that I'm going to be playing against, let's say, a passive response, so my opponent's going to respond a little bit too passively to that aggression, all that does is, going back to my 3-bet range here, it frees me up to be a little bit more aggressive with all that marginal stuff that I just talked about. So like,
Thing.
if I'm
Okay.
not that worried that I'm going to face the 4-bet and I've got, your jack 10 suiteds, your king jack offsuits, your king 8 suiteds or whatever, these are kind of your middle strength, pretty good hands. They're not going to get punished by 3-betting a lot. So just go ahead and 3-bet. Like, it's going to work out well because you're not going to face that counter aggression too often. But honestly, like, you can make the argument that applies to almost any hand that's reasonable to 3-bet. If you're going to 3-bet and you're not going to face that counter aggression, you're going to see more flops. You're going to make some pairs. You're going to flop some draws. Like, good things are going to happen. And all of a sudden, it's going to be a profitable 3-bet. So really just increase the aggression across the board if you're not facing counter aggression. That's the main
Right.
takeaway, I think.
So that makes sense. So the way you explained it makes a lot of sense to me, which is that against somebody 4-betting, those are hands are too good. We really would just rather not put ourselves in that position. But against someone who isn't 4-betting, those become more value hands, and then you can start to adjust by that. Would you then take out queen deuce, queen 3, queen 4, and those type of hands, or would you still want to mix it up like that and kind of build that strategy too?
3-bet hands. My main question is, how often are they folding? So, like, in theory, against this size, we get 62.9% folds, right? That's a good chunk of equity that we're clearing out. 3-betting the queen deuce suited, I guess it just works out fine when that happens. But if we were playing an opponent who's super sticky, never folding pre-flop, they take flops with all sorts of stuff, we just need value. Like, we just need good hands in our 3-bet range, right? But
Mm.
the amount of 4-bet aggression we're facing might not really matter that much when we have queen deuce, because, like, we face a 4-bet, we just fold. Doesn't really matter. But I'm looking for folds. Like, we're hoping we get at least that 62% folding frequency to 3-bet kind of those, I guess you call it a semi bluff. And
Mhm.
if we're not there, then I think those hands are just going to call.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, because I feel like those are gonna be the common opponents you're gonna play against, is you're gonna see a overly passive one. I mean, they still might be folding the same amount, but they're just 4-betting much less, and they're just calling with that specific range. Obviously, you're gonna have players who go crazy, and they're calling everything. You're gonna have some people who just start 4-betting you. So, I'm kind of just thinking about a game plan for each of those players that I'm gonna come across, that I'm gonna encounter in real life or online. So, yeah. So I think it's good to be versatile and be prepared. And I guess so. When you're in the other position now, so if I'm from the small blind, I'm facing this 3-bet. What are the factors, or what are the most important things I should be considering when I'm either going to call, or I'm going to 4-bet, or I'm going to fold?
One of the most important things, I guess, to play off of what you're just talking about is, if you're not sure that your opponent is aggressive enough, if you're kind of generally assuming that people are a little bit too passive, or it's very common to run into someone who's too passive, this 3-bet range is supposed to have, like we just said, a lot of weak hands in it, right? I think the stronger hands, like the suited broadways, all the stuff up here, not that hard for people to think to 3-bet this stuff in heads up. 9-5 suited, 8 deuce suited, king 6 offsuit, a little bit harder to find this stuff. So if you're playing someone who, the 3-bet frequency is 16% or 18%, or maybe you don't know the frequency, but you're just never seeing these marginal hands,
Hmm.
we really have to reconsider 4-betting this player, right? Not only, like, are we unlikely to get the right amount of folds because they're just 3-betting all their good hands and they're missing the weak ones, but we're just not even sure if our hand is good enough to continue in the first place. So I think last time we spoke, I talked about how, like, the 4-bet bluffs usually come from these low in the range, kind of 0 EV type hands, right? All these have zeros next to them. This is the EV of whatever, like the highest EV that you're going to generate with this hand. So all these 0 EV 4-bets, like, get rid of it, right? They're not making you any money if they're if they're too passive, if they're too weak with their 3-bet range. And even with the calls, like, you always want to pay attention to the EV of these pre-flop decisions. People get really caught up in like pure decisions. This 9-6 suited is a pure call. 100% of the time it's calling. It's making 0.07 big blinds. Like, change the 3-bet frequency by a fraction and that's going to go away, right? So we want to pay attention to these EVs. You don't need to play these bottom hands that are worth almost nothing if your opponent's not 3-betting enough. And of course, this goes the other way. If you think they're 3-betting too much, start increasing that 4-bet aggression. Maybe go a little bit thinner for value with that 4-bet aggression. This can go in both directions.
So, okay, so, that's kind of opposite how I might think about it at PLO because I get 4 cards. So if I know you're very tight, I'm going to call you with any 4 cards because on certain boards, you just don't have enough coverage and you never are going to win those boards. And then sometimes you're just making the mistake of stacking off too wide with your top
Yeah.
of range. So like that would be my, that's kind of, and I've been getting better at what you just said, which is recognizing if someone I'm playing is just a lot tighter. I still feel like I just love calling all these suited hands. Like I'm not folding king 4, king 3, king deuce, queen 5, queen 6. Like
Mm.
I just feel like I always want to call. And I guess what you're saying is that I should really just consider folding those because their range is just stronger and we just have better hands and we don't really need to get ourselves in that situation.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
depends how they play
definitely.
post flop too.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think we should get into that because like, I mean, it's hard to go backwards and say, oh, you should have made these pre-flop adjustments based on how they play post-flop, but the same dynamic we're talking about right now is going to carry forward. If someone generally plays too passive, that means you're gonna realize your equity. Like you can just kind of take your price, see more cards, realize more equity, gain more EV. Like that's kind of the formula, right? If someone's really aggressive, it's going to be hard to see more cards. You're going to need to you're just going to need good hands against someone who's really aggressive. Um, so looking ahead a little bit, you can definitely think, okay, my opponent's tight. I'm going to play hands that have a good chance to outdraw them. Uh, their range is going to be well defined, but you need a path to like realizing that equity. You need a path to seeing 4 cards or seeing 5 cards and actually getting the money in good, right? This is definitely harder to do in no limit because if you've got 6-5 suited against aces, like you're just not going to flop a good enough hand to see the turn often, like all that often, right? And we're paying 10 big blinds into 15 right now to get that opportunity. So it's really important that you just have the right price and that you're actually going to flop something often enough. And if you play around with node locking enough, I think you can get a good sense of those variables.
All right, cool. So I mean, obviously here we could also adjust sizes potentially with the custom solutions, but let's stick to this drill and yeah, I mean, let's get into the post flop.
Sounds
This is where the fun really begins. Out of position. So I prefer in position and 3-bet pots. Out of position and 3-bet pots, I feel like is it's definitely taken me a lot more to learn because I'm not very used to doing that block size with 20% or 25% out of position. Just was like a very foreign concept to me coming into heads up. So it's taken me a time to adjust, but I feel like I'm getting the hang of it. And so 3-bet pots, ace, king, 3, what's going through our mind as the out of position player here? And what should we be considering betting, checking, and then maybe how to think about mixing that up?
There's a few spots that I like to show to really get the point across or what's unique about 3-bet pots and heads up, and this is one of them. But I do want to just make sure that everyone watching kind of has a good sense of the way that these are set up. So the solution that I'm using here is using dynamic bet sizing. What dynamic bet sizing means is that every flop we put in is going to give us a different single bet size that it's recommending to use on this particular board. So on ace king 3 right now, it's saying like 67% was not my choice. It was the AI engine's choice, right? If I change this to ace 6-3, it's going to give me a different option. This is not guaranteed. It's just something I know from having studied these spots. So here you're going to see 25% as the chosen bet size, right? I have some opinions on whether or not we should be emulating the chosen bet size, but as long as we're on the same page, like how we're getting here, then it's a little bit easier to talk about.
Right. I don't follow the chosen bet size often. I sort of have my own way I think about sizing, but I like
Yeah.
to do different fixed strategies on here too. I sometimes go with the dynamic. I like to train with everything. I've really been using the custom solutions a lot more to try different sizes. So do you just, if you were going to recommend to someone, would you just say focus on the dynamic and then kind of start from there on the flop and just use one size as your strategy out of position on you know, all these different textures, or how would you go upon thinking about that or remembering that?
So it kind of depends where someone's at in learning heads up. Like I often recommend to someone who has never really played this format before, doesn't really know what bet sizes they want to use, doesn't really have a plan in place for playing heads up. If you just want a good, simple solution to get presented in front of you, like use the automatic settings or use the dynamic settings. This is the best way to just kind of make the whole process a little snappier, a little more intuitive. You're just not overloaded with options for, oh, like, you know, how do I use all these bet sizes? I don't know which size to bet here. The training is just going to be a little more straightforward, right? The training is going to be better check. It's not going to be a whole bunch of different decision points. I think that's great. And it also just kind of gives you, it's like playing on training mode almost. Like you're getting a little bit of help from the computer. It says like, hey, by the way, like you should probably use this bet size.
Mhm.
I like that for anyone who's not coming in with a predetermined plan for how they like to play heads up. But then if I work with someone a little more advanced, a little more particular about how they want to play, they've got bet sizes that make sense to them, maybe from other games, they've got a plan that makes sense to them and they like to use that plan. I say forget the dynamic sizing. Like put in your sizes, right? Put in the sizes you like, the ones that make sense to you. Restrict the drill to those sizes. Now the solver is going to build everything for you. Like now it's going to build around what makes sense to you. The strategies are still going to be great. Most likely you're not going to lose much EV. Like it doesn't really matter. I don't push people to learn a whole bunch of bet sizes they're not comfortable with. But if you're a blank slate and you've got no sizes in mind, you use the automatic ones, right? Like you use the ones that are GTO recommended.
Mhm. All right, that makes a lot of sense. I'd say I started at the dynamic and now I'm at a different point. So yeah, that makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. I see what you're saying. I see exactly what you're saying. Okay. So I guess on these boards, you know, what determines using a small bet size versus a large bet size at the 100 big blind stack level?
Yeah. So a couple things that I pay attention to when I'm going through different boards for three bet pots. One thing is just like, what's the equity matchup? And this is what I talked about at the beginning. Right now, you can see on screen that the big blind on this board has 52.6% equity. Small blind has 47. To me, this is kind of crazy to think about, like having played a lot of tournaments lately and having played six max cash in the past. Normally, when you three bet pre-flop and you get called and you get an ace high board, like you should be way ahead in these situations. You're a 52% favorite. So like you're not a huge favorite. You're not pushing a massive advantage. This is a situation where you don't necessarily want to bet huge, high frequency with everything. But your medium strength hands are going to like in situations like that, in situations like where it's close, your medium strength hands are going to determine a lot of the strategy. So the question is really like a6-3, do I want to be betting all these I'm just gonna, you know, like this entire chunk of pocket pairs, these stronger king high hands, all the weaker aces. You've got all these hands that are pretty good, like they're 60 to 80% equity. Do we want to bet those hands on this board? Sure. Like it's pretty good to just put in a small bet and get some protection. Um, Whereas in kind of stark contrast, that first board that I showed, you go to ace king three. Now all of a sudden it's like, honestly, all those medium strength hands, those weaker aces that are now a little bit worse, those pocket pairs are now a little bit worse. Maybe I don't want to bet those hands. And another big thing that's happened here, right? Equity is now 50-50, just dead even, range versus range. So the way I'm thinking about it is, do I have like this linear advantage where my medium strength hands want to take a stab? If yes,
Mm.
then maybe that small size strategy makes sense. Is this more of a 50-50 spot where it's just, I've got my best hands and I've got my bluffs? Well, then maybe I want to use a big bet size, right? That's kind of the simplest version of playing out of position strategy, is just quickly identifying, is this a linear situation or is this a polar situation? Um, and the best way to, like, you're always going to have the best hands, like the top end hands in your three bet range.
Mhm.
But the question is, how good are my medium hands? Like how good is second pair? How good is weak top pair? How good are all these other hands that I have, right?
Mhm. So an ace-6-3, you're saying that those medium hands, you know, the opponent's gonna have a 6 sometimes, a 3 sometimes. They're gonna have other weaker non-aces. So those are weaker hands. Again, also we can improve with like a king high or a queen high. Versus on this board, a lot of our weaker hands really can't improve, and we're not ahead of second pair. So in this scenario, a lot of those cards are ahead of second pair. So we can think about because it's kind of like a weird 20% check. I mean, I would have a hard time maybe thinking about okay, well, what would be the 20% I check? Maybe like king queen with diamonds that doesn't have a backdoor flush draw. That would kind of be my intuition. Then all these like offsuit hands would be my intuition is we're gonna have some backdoor blocker to one of the backdoor flush draws or something like that. And then, you just have to be really disciplined on the turn because once you go quarter here, you're gonna get a lot of spicy turns where you're gonna be in you're gonna be a lost animal in the wild if they're just calling you very wide, and then, you're gonna have to give up on the turn. So, that would be my hesitancy here of building out this really aggressive strategy is that I think the turn and river, I might find myself in some trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. Like, again, the way that so if I take that idea of, having linear strategies and having polar strategies, what I'm really saying is, are we going to play a polar strategy from the very beginning of the hand, like from the flop, or are we going to delay that to later? And on a6-3 here, what we're kind of saying is I've got a good like linear small advantage here. I'm going to take a stab with pretty much everything. And to your question about like what to check and specifically what, like I don't think it's that big of a deal to play the checking range. You could probably just round this off to a range bet. It's hard to
Mhm.
exploit. But like all we're saying is I've got a small advantage here. Let's take a stab. Let's get to a turn. Then I'm going to build my polar strategy. All we're doing is we're delaying that to the next street. So this board ends up being kind of a throwaway, like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to stab here. Let's play this part of the game. And then once we get to the turn, let's start splitting off and doing that polarized strategy. Um, then on certain boards, like the ace king, and I would just say pretty much any double Broadway, that's the heuristic I use. Any two Broadway flop, two Broadway cards and like a disconnected third card. We just go big bet right away, play a polar strategy right away. Um,
Mhm.
from the flop because we're not interested in making that small bet with the middle of our range.
Interesting. And you would never deviate. You would never just say, well, let me just maybe sometimes do a quarter strategy here and just range bet this as well. You just think that doesn't make any sense, or what would be
Well,
your reason for
good.
that?
It's a good question. Like this does come up a lot, honestly, because I think what it starts to get at is like, how often do we need to stick to our balanced strategy for the sake of balance? You don't have to. Like you always have you always have the freedom to just say, I don't really care that much about balance. But here's the issue I have with like sometimes when people get the idea that, let's say, for example, 8-6 suited is supposed to check this flop. And they're like, why would I check this flop with 8-6 suited when I can just make a small bet and it's a profitable bluff because I know my opponents are going to fold too much? Okay, well, that's a good idea. Like, I like if you have an exploitative idea that you can just take 8-6 suited, take a small stab, and make money, you should probably do that, right? But then do we have to like bring pocket tens along for the ride? Because pocket tens really doesn't want to bet the flop. Like pocket tens, like if we all of a sudden decide, okay, well, because my bluffs could make some money here, I'm just going to range bet small. It's like, well, hold on a second. Like you've got medium strength hands that are now losing money in service of your bluffs that were making money, right? So like if you want to make a decision to just be unbalanced and say, I think a bluff here is good for small size, let's generate some folds and get a quick win. I'm on board with that. But that's in my mind, that's a decision to be unbalanced, to just like break from all the structure, break from the whole like range awareness situation and just play your hand basically. And
Right.
I do a whole lot of playing my hand against certain opponents, right? Like if you're playing the right person, you should absolutely just play your hand. Um,
Mhm.
but what worries me is when players get caught up in the idea that they need to bring their whole strategy with and say like, oh, well, it just makes sense to simplify to range bet small, right? It's like, well, maybe not. Like maybe pocket queens just loses too much money and jacks and tens and, king queen, like maybe these hands just lose too much money by doing that. And you'd rather
Mhm.
just check and hope your opponent hits a bad third pair on the turn. Like that's going to make you more money than just stabbing small and having them fold all their bad hands.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the player might say 6-8 suited will range bet, tens will check, ace queen will ace king will bet size up. You know what I mean? Yeah, kind of what you said. Play your hand versus a different opponent.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
the thesis that it doesn't matter if you're unbalanced and they're not going to be able to exploit it. Which, you could argue that actually might be true because you need a lot of hands on players. You need to see showdowns. You need to have a size before you can really pick up on what they're doing. So just because, you know what I mean, it's hard to really make some deeper assumptions on just off of that data. So it is kind of interesting to think about. I guess okay. So when we do bet here, then I guess let's go into small blind and say, okay, well, what's our thought process when we're considering defending, when we're considering potentially bluff raising and then folding?
A couple things happen, generally speaking, when you're facing this big bet from the start. So we'll look at, like, we're assuming the big blind is using this polar strategy. They're making a large bet on the flop. When they're making that large bet, if I just go back to the range for a second, you can see that the good hands that they have, the value hands that they have, are pretty specific. Like, we're basically looking at ace 10 plus for value. Very, very, very tight range, very specific range for value. So when we're responding to that big bet, there's really no need to raise anything, right? Like, it doesn't make that much sense. Your opponent's making a statement. I've got a really good value hand, or I've got a bluff. And there's really no draws on board to speak of. There's no concern about preserving equity or whatnot. So, like, if you've got a good hand, you just call. If you've got ace 3 suited, you just call. King 3 suited, pocket threes, pocket aces, trapping preflop. You just call these hands. There's no need to raise with anything. I think that's like an important point to make when you see this big bet size.
Mhm.
And I generally assume that big bet size is it's polar the way it's supposed to be. Like, you don't see a lot of people who come out blasting for a huge size and they've actually got ace deuce, or they've got king jack or something, right? Like, they've usually got what they say they have. So I think it makes sense to just go with the call only approach. And then the other side of it is you just want to be pretty tight. I mean, that they've made a huge bet. We can't be particularly speculative. You can see that, like, pocket pairs make no money. They should just fold. We got jacks in here sometimes. It's also making almost nothing. You could probably just fold. And even gut shots are not making that much money. Like, these are pretty marginal calls. So you've got a situation where you play pretty straightforward and tight. You just fold unless you have, like, a board pair, or a good draw, and you call everything else.
But no peel-in, double backdoor, straight draw, flush draws here, because that's
Yeah.
my first instinct. What I look at is I say, okay, what is the bottom of my range here? And can I, obviously gutters. So most of my gutters I'll peel with. But if I have like a 5-6, if I have,
Yeah.
and I guess in this situation, yeah, queen nine, those aren't really a backdoor, double backdoors. But I guess queen
Yeah.
ten suited, I got a gutter and I got a double backdoor. I got a backdoor flush draw and I got an immediate gutter. So it's actually a little more powerful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this spot seems relatively easy, 100 big blinds deep, but I'm guessing 200 big blinds, you have maybe 200 big blinds plus, you have a bit more incentive with some of your gut shots and maybe some of your other hands to potentially draw out of the back door. But I guess this just seems like a real easy strategy to play and just call with your pairs and your straight draws and fold everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, like, even when you're deeper, you're just getting a really bad price. Like, that's all it is you're just facing a huge bet on a board where not that much is likely to change.
Mhm.
And if not that much changes, you're probably facing another huge bet on the turn. That's just kind of how the strategy is going to look. When playing defense in these spots, like, the big takeaway for me, especially like using the trainer, the thing I'm trying to focus on is responding to my pot odds well. Like, how well do I adapt to the times that I'm facing the big size versus the small size? And if we just switch to the other board texture that we've been talking about, we can see how drastically the defense changes when the bet size is cheap. Because now that the bet size is cheap, like, you don't need to draw at all. Like, you don't even need, I don't know, is queen jack offsuit a double backdoor? Like, you've got nothing here. You've just got a couple of cards that are high-ish. You've got, like,
Why do they call the diamond instead of the heart? That's the part that I think you explained this to me before, but it doesn't really like, because you said something about you wanna reverse block their backdoor flush draws or something like that, which
Yeah, I remember
why
getting
exactly?
into
Or
Yeah, we got into the weeds a little bit last time. This one, I mean, the first thing I want to point out before I get too deep into it is that the difference here is so small. Like here we've got the diamond is generating 0 and the no diamond is losing 0.02. Like we're really, really splitting hairs here. But the thing you're observing seems pretty consistent with all these hands. Like it is something. It's caused by something. I would go back, I would look at the bluffs on the flop, and then I would use our filters to see what's happening with offsuit hands that include a diamond, what's happening with offsuit hands that exclude a diamond. Looks like the diamonds are betting 70% of the time. The no diamond hands are betting 85% of the time. So we might be onto something there, you know, like, and if we look at suited hands, the no diamond hands betting 85% of the time, the double diamond hands 80%. Looks to me like basically the betting frequency is higher without diamonds. That's kind of the quick impression I just got. Like
Mhm.
I feel like I'd be making stuff up if I went any deeper than this, but this would be like kind of my instinct
Yep.
just to look for what's happening with the betting frequency if they have a diamond or if they don't, you know?
Yeah, I feel like there's something really big in this concept. I've been thinking about it a lot more lately, but maybe we move on and think about it for next time. But yeah, because we are
Yeah.
kind of getting in the weeds with it. But those are the things that are real interesting to me to think about right now. And if you can kind of decode your opponent's strategy a little bit better, then
Yeah.
you can identify some
I mean, a
opportunities.
thing that's relevant here, and just as I talk about what you should be calling it, it kind of comes together a little bit. Is like when you're facing this cheap of a price, you're facing basically like a full range bet from a range again that's not all that strong. Like the big blind 3-bet range is strong, but it's not all that strong. Um, backdoor flush draw is good enough on this board. Facing this bet size in this situation, any backdoor flush draw is good enough. So when you've got, Jack 8 suited, which has no straight draws whatsoever, you've got just 3 hearts in your hand, you're making a small blind by calling this hand. Um, but you can see all this whole chunk of hands here, these suited hands that are only good enough to call with backdoor flush draws, they fold when you have diamonds. So that's a lot of diamond combos that are folding the flop. So if you think about like how heads up games work, any edge you can find on one side like is being caused by the other, right? Any advantage you can find from the big blind's point of view is coming from what the small blind's doing. So small blind has to fold double diamond hands on the flop. Well, if you just if you don't do anything to your strategy to like add more diamonds to your calling range, then now your opponent has a good blocker choice to make, right? Now your opponent can say, well, every time I have a diamond in my hand, I know that you're more likely to hold a call. And every time I don't have a diamond in my hand, I know you're more likely to hold a fold. Like we can kind of make this. So the folding range is so specific on this board. The folding range is diamonds, basically. So it makes sense to me if we ignore like the hand versus hand properties, just think of it as a game of like, I'm betting on how often you'll fold here. Well, you don't want to tell your opponent every time you know I have a diamond, I'm folding. Like, no, I got to fight back. I got to add some diamonds to my calling range. I got to add some diamonds to like counteract. I think this is kind of like if I don't try to interpret the specifics of each hand, I think that's the bigger picture of what's going on. Is like I don't want to give my opponent any info that he can just bluff me whenever he thinks out the diamond, right?
That's crazy. That makes so much sense, but I never thought about that part. Yeah, I mean
This is the stuff. This is the great stuff from Heads Up is like just learning the push and pull of exploits, right? I mean, this is what we're learning. It's just a rock, paper, scissors game, but like way more complicated.
okay. So let's say we call here. Let's get to the turn. This is where all the magic goes down. Is on the turn. This is the part of heads up that I think is this is one of the most challenging parts for me is on the turn.
So, I mean, what I mentioned before, and I'll talk about it again now, is we're playing one of those boards where there's a high frequency small bet on the flop. So all we were doing was delaying that polarized aggression. All we're doing is delaying the point where we pretty much do the same thing. If you remember the ace king 3 board was just like ace 10 plus on the flop and maybe a little bit of ace 9. And now we've just like we've walked to the turn kind of slowly and then just cut off the betting range at the same point. and we're just bluffing with low cards that are basically the same kind of bluffs that we would have bluffed on the flop in the previous situation. So like nothing's really changed. It's the same pre-flop ranges. Not that many hands have left either range. Like I bet most my hands as the big blind. I called most of my hands as the small blind. We're just here at the turn with like the same range makeup that we had on the other board on the flop. So if you get good at kind of figuring out what a stack worthy hand is, you know, what a put all the money in kind of hand strength is on a given board texture, it's just going to apply to all the other variations of that board. All the ace high boards that we're looking at, ace high boards that don't have straights or flushes. That's basically what we've narrowed in on here. So we can play with, based on the turn card, what have we changed about the makeup of this board? What have we changed as a result of the makeup of like what is good enough to go for value? Well, like one, you know, big change that I can think of is let's pair the ace. So now the whole board is going to look different. Like now we're not just playing ace 10 or better, that's what my good hands are. Now it's like, oh, the ace paired, like now pocket sevens is a good hand, right? Now we've completely changed the makeup of the board. So we're not playing the same spot anymore. Or if I had put a flush draw on the flop, I don't want to change everything, but you know, if I had put a flush draw on the flop and then completed the flush on the turn, well, now I've moved things in the other direction. Now I've made an ace 10 type hand a lot worse. So maybe the range makeup is going to change in that way.
Right.
To me, the most important thing to learn, and I think we talked about before, like using drills to kind of get to the point where you get comfortable with this, but it's just like, what's the value threshold for me to want to keep putting money in the pot? And if I'm below that threshold, if I'm like, oh, I don't have a good enough hand to be part of that turn polarized strategy, well, I'm just going to check and I'm going to play defense.
So I guess right now, I mean, obviously we could spend a lot of time on the check line because that's a whole other kind of thing. But maybe let's focus on the betting today and how to defend that betting. So if we make it 10, which I think is gonna be probably one of the easier boards to maybe play, maybe kind of build your strategy. So the bluffs, I'm guessing, are going to be your gutters, your backdoor flush draws, and your straight draws on the flop. But I guess I would have a problem come into a mix on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe it's easy enough because I kind of see a lot of those hands. It looks like they're just betting with the flush draw only, and then they're checking everything else, and they're still gonna bet the straight draws, high frequency, like 7-5, 4-5. How would you decode this, or what are you taking away, or what do you see in here? What stands out to you about this shape?
Yeah, I mean, if we're just focusing on the bluffs for a minute, because I do want to get back to what we're doing for value. The concept that we brought up in our last video was thinking about what we're trying to get to fold. So like thinking about what the hands that we're like now that we know our bet size, we know it's a 67% bet. Trying to visualize like from that huge range that the small blind brought to the turn, what kind of hands are we going to get them to fold? Most likely. I mean, we don't know how our opponent plays, but we know their pre-flop range roughly. We know what hands are going to arrive here roughly. So big chunk of the small blind calling range, and I won't show the answer just yet, but I'll just show the general range. A big chunk of the small blind calling range combination-wise is offsuit broadways and pocket pairs. So offsuit broadways didn't all make it to the turn. Like some of those hands did fold, right? So they're maybe not the most important part of the strategy, but they're there. And pocket pairs, they all made it to the turn. So the pocket pairs are pretty important. So just kind of thinking about what those chunks of hands are going to do is going to help me determine what I like to bluff, or what my betting strategy is going to look like in general. So if I'm trying to kind of hold that in my head, I'll look at the 10, say like, okay, on the 10, well, if they did have a Broadway hand on the flop, like a king queen or a jack 10 or a king 10 or queen 10 or whatever, they kind of improved and they're probably going to call the turn bet. So like, it's not crazy on this board to bluff with my high gut shots, right? Like I think we talked about a spot last time where bluffing the high gut shots wasn't that great because it blocked the folds. It's like it's not crazy to me on this board to bluff the high gut shots because that might actually interact with some hands that are going to call me. But in terms of like low cards, I'll be a little more selective because I think pocket sevens, fives, fours, deuces, eights, maybe nines, if they didn't four bet us pre, like all these hands are going to fold the turn. Those hands are going to fold the turn for sure. So now if I look a step ahead, I can test to see if I'm doing an okay job here. It's like, all right, the pocket pairs are folding all the way up to nines. Nines is close. King queen is close. I guess like I might have overestimated that king queen and king jack were gonna continue to the river. So there might be some, there's some Broadway hands we can fold out. But the exercise I'm doing there is I'm trying to visualize what I'm making my opponent fold. And then as a result, pick out like, okay, what preference do I have for bluffing? I think I have a slight preference for bluffing like the high gut shots, or a slight preference for bluffing hands that like don't have too low cards that block all those pocket pairs. Maybe I've got, whatever, these high-low hands seem decent, the high-low spades. But obviously, as you can see here from the strategy, like 5-4 suited, it's a low gut shot. It's doing or a low open ender. It's doing just fine bluffing. 8-7, 9-7, whatever. These hands are low gut shots and low open enders. They're all doing just fine, like you said. Nothing wrong with bluffing those hands. I'm pretty much just reinforcing that like it's not always my concern that we hit the mix. I just try to visualize like what am I accomplishing here? What am I hoping to accomplish here? And then looking at my bluff, like does this hand seem like a reasonable one to accomplish that? Right? Like am I doing a good job with making sure that they can fold enough of their folding range?
Okay, so if we do bet here, then I'm assuming that we're going to call with our aces, our flush draws, and it's probably it. Maybe our open-ended straight draws, and if we have 4-5 or something like that, we'll probably call with that too. And then, because we want to have some hands that we can bluff on the river with too, so I'm imagining those are going to be our potentially missed flush draws, which aren't necessarily going to be the best combos, but our straight draws are probably going to be the ones that we're going to end up bluffing with on the river if it misses and they check to us.
Your description was pretty close. The only thing you left out seems to be like the 10x hands that floated the flop. Just kind of keeping in mind that we've got pretty much everything getting to the turn. So even a random turned card can end up being a pretty significant amount of the turn calling range. Because if we had a 10 in our hand, we were still pretty likely to call the flop because we called almost everything on the flop. So that's like the only weird thing about range analysis in these spots is like sometimes if I look at the second pair versus, third pair, low pair categories, like we're calling more 10s on the turn than we are 6s or 3s, even though the 6s and the 3s were the cards that came on the flop. It's like a little bit weird that that's the case, but that's just because we didn't fold that many 10s on the flop. But otherwise, yeah, like I think that these parts are a little more intuitive as to like what hands are good enough to call versus fold. And it's really only a challenge when you get to those spots where you're just like breaking everything. The only other turn cards I might show is like, let's say the low card completes, and the only way that you connect with this low card is with your suited stuff. So you have a whole bunch of offsuit hands that have now missed. Now playing defense might look a little bit trickier because now you've got anything that's connected on that low part of the board is always continuing. You even got some hands that have like kind of mediocre. I mean, these are club draws for the most part, but there's some kind of mediocre draws in here that are reaching the river. And you can see that like the pocket pairs that were previously not worth that much might be worth a little bit more. You got deuces in here. You got jacks making more money. So like things can shift around a little bit depending on how often you actually connect with that card. But other than that, like, yeah, top pair's not going anywhere. Good draws are not going anywhere. That's the most important hand category.
Okay, so we go back to that 10, then I guess let's say hypothetically, we think our opponent calls the flop a lot to our block size and then overfolds the turn. And I guess I've node locked a lot of these ones. So sometimes even if you start to node lock, you realize like they're just not folding an ace or a 10 ever here. So, like, let's say they're folding some of the threes, they're folding some of the sixes versus the bigger size. How would you think about adding in bluffs here as an exploit versus somebody who was overfolding?
The great thing with these heads up ranges is that there's never a shortage of bluffs for you to choose from, right? Like the big challenge in my mind for all these like low frequency betting spots is how do I stop myself from over bluffing? Like how do I make sure that I don't accidentally bluff way too many hands? But if you have that impression that you're on a turn or just playing a spot in general where people don't call enough, like they just don't continue enough, I should say.
Mhm.
Um, you just go, you have anything to go nuts. I mean, you have so many hands that are going to lose once they check here. Uh, Really, like the overall idea would be look at our equities, or maybe I'll show strategy plus equity. Look at our equities, find all the worst hands that are currently checking sometimes, right? Take all these 12, 13% hands, take all these 20% hands, all these 12% hands. You got so much trash in your range uh, that under normal circumstances is checking to control frequencies and balance. Don't bother, right? I mean, just keep firing. Um,
Mhm.
there's almost never a situation in heads up where where like the challenge is that we need to search for bluffs. We need to go finding them from somewhere. If you're playing your pre-flop range as well, you're just going to have them. And you just push them towards 100% bluffing frequency in those spots.
So you wanna choose the ones that are at the bottom of the equity, basically the ones that have the lowest equity versus choosing ones that have more like 50% equity.
Yeah, that would be my preference. I think that's like there's a certain comfort around bluffing with equity. You know, like
Mhm.
there's a default idea in among a lot of poker players that if you're gonna bluff a situation, you should start with your draws because that gives you a backup plan. But
Mhm.
like really, if you wanted to maximize your EV of your total range, if you wanted your total strategy to make the most money possible, you would bluff as often as you could with all the worst hands that you have. Because your hands with 50% equity, they can do something else. I mean, they could check, face aggression, and maybe call, right? Or they could check and have it check all the way down, and they don't have to lose 100% of the pot. They might only lose, you know, 70% of the pot or 80% of the pot or whatever. You're going to get some money back with those hands. So I think it's important to remember that like the worse your hand is, the worse your hand is. If I just show like, check face aggression, all those weak hands are just going to check fold and they're going to lose their share of the pot. So those are the hands we should start with, right? Those are the hands we should bluff first.
Yeah, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's crazy to think about, but yeah, so you're basically saying when we lose to those hands and those are our range, then by betting those and getting more folds, I guess we could compound this the other way and it goes the other way where this might be the easiest way to get us in some hot water is that if we think they're overfolding and we start going 2/3 here and then we end up at the bottom of our range on the river and we kind of take the same heuristic to the river and then go crazy with it on the river, then we can end up making some massive blunders. So
True.
might be almost an argument to, be careful with that. Be careful when turn the gas on the 12% hands and the 19% hands, 20%. You gotta be really damn sure that
Yeah.
they're doing what you think they're doing, I guess, would be
Yeah.
a kind of way to maybe think about that.
Yeah. I mean, the the thing strategically I want to bring up for these spots and like, it can help us kind of close out this board category a little bit is that you're gonna have to learn to play a lot of different lines in heads up. Um, and you can see in these situations like on the 10, it's useful for us to look into the betting strategy, but it's not the majority action. Like 58% of the time you're checking this turn. And just because you've checked the turn, to your point about like not wanting to overdo things and not wanting to get into really sticky situations, like once we've checked the turn, 62% of the time it's going to check back. So we're going to have more opportunities. Like we don't have to bluff right now, this hand, this moment in this hand. Uh,
Mhm.
we know that there's a good chunk of scenarios that are going to go check, check. And now we get to take a bunch of that stuff that I highlighted and take a stab at the pot on the river. And
Interesting.
there's so many players who are even more vulnerable in these spots than they are in the barrel spots because they don't get as much attention usually. Um,
Mhm.
so I want to bring some attention to the fact that, if you're playing a board like ace 6-3 here, where you're almost always betting the flop, and you're almost always getting called. The most important part of this strategy to study is now the turn checking range, right? Because this is the most frequent line you're going to play on this board. Like by far, this is the most frequent line you're going to play on this board. You're always going to bet the flop. You're always going to get called, basically, right? So every time you 3-bet pre and you get ace high dry, you're just at the turn checking. Like that's the most important line that you're going to play in this scenario. And similarly, if we go back to that ace king 3 board that we showed at the beginning, the most important thing to learn on ace king 3 is how to check, because you do it 72% of the time, right? So like there's so much, and this is what I build into those drill sheets that I showed you. This is what I teach to players who are working on their heads up game. It's like you don't just want to by default study the most aggressive action at every node. And figure out how to bluff only in that way. Figure out how to bluff, you know what I mean? Like only in that particular way. You got a lot of bluffs. You're going to have to put them in all the different lines. You got a lot of weak hands. You're going to have to learn to play defense. I mean, it's, as you can tell, this is a whole nother topic to get into, right? But in my mind, this is where the really great players start to separate themselves, is they're comfortable in all the different nodes. They're comfortable going down the checking line and playing, you know, check on the turn and then still finding bluffs, or checking flop and still finding check raises, you know, checking the turn and still finding check raises. That stuff takes a lot of extra effort.
Cool. All right. So yeah, we're definitely going to have to spend a lot more time on what you just said about being comfortable in the check. Today, we're focused on the aggression. So let's focus on continuing that aggression to the river and close this one out strong. So on the river, what's going to be our main characteristics on the river? Because it seems like most times I'm going to use I'm going to do a check, or in this kind of particular situation, if I go block 2/3, I'm probably either going all in or I'm checking. I don't think I'm ever going to block, but maybe there are some reasons to do that, or some other exploitive considerations to do that. But in general, how are you approaching the river in this particular line of the 25, 67, and then 67 or check?
So I want to emphasize what to pay attention to with our value hands, partly because when we studied single raise pots in the last video, we talked about like the exact removal effects for bluffing that I would talk about here. And I'll maybe just, you know, quickly point in the direction of, you know, if you know what your opponent's calling with on the turn, mostly top pairs and flush draws, maybe a handful of second pairs or straight draws, then we kind of know what we want to bluff on various rivers by paying attention to what their weakest hands are. So when that flush misses, we know there's a lot of missed flush draws. We know we want to bluff without spades. We know when the flush comes in, we want them not to have a flush, we bluff with a spade. Maybe if, you know, the 10 pairs or the, you know, some other factor like makes their range better on a slightly different board texture, then we can adjust to that. But in general, I think that the same bluffing principles apply from single raise pots to 3-bet pots when we're studying this line.
That makes a lot of sense. So you want to look at what they're going to fold, and then you want to reverse block what they're folding as your bluffs, because that way when you bluff with that hand, then they're going to have that hand to fold.
Yeah. And
so
like
here, you wouldn't want to have the 7, 8s, or 9s, or maybe even 4s and 5s, because you want him to have those hands as their bluffs.
Yeah, I mean here, well, so in this spot, a good chunk of those weaker pocket pairs did fold the turn, but he does arrive to the river with like 9s and a few of those suited 10s that have the cards you're talking about. Very reliably, what they're going to miss with is spades, so double spade hands. But even more than that, what they're going to, like some of the stuff that you just spoke about is exactly what they're going to have. I think if we like zoom in on some of these bluffs, you can see that the double spade hands are just always giving up. But then, you know, the 9s and the 8s and the 7s, they're okay bluff cards. They work out fine. We're also seeing some bluffs from the lower hands. And generally speaking, like all your worst hands, as long as they don't have horrible properties, are pretty likely to be your first bluffs. So we've got the very worst hands, you know, the 5-4s, even the 3 deuce, which has a pair, but it's weak enough, I suppose, to be bluffing with. But all these super low cards, it doesn't surprise me at all to see them firing. And the higher cards like king nine suited, for example, just all the worst properties generally just giving up. Um, I think that if I just kind of change the river to emphasize what might really change the strategy is paying
Oh
attention
yeah.
to like how good our value hands are. So the main problem that could happen with the ranges we just described is that a flush completes on the river. Um, Especially if a flush completes that gives our opponent some other strong hands as well. So let's say on the Jack of Spades river, not only do they make a bunch of flushes, but they also improve to two pair with Jack 10 and Ace Jack. So a big chunk of the hands that we were so excited about on the turn, these Ace Queens, these Ace Kings, are now pretty mediocre hands. And now we're stuck with this strategy that doesn't we're out of position now, right? So like we need to be able to play defense still. We can't just fire off or end the hand like we could in single raise pots, right? We need to have that extra plan for, well, what happens once we check or what happens when we bet small. So really what I like to track more than anything else when I'm building my overall range is what happened to all those, like what happened to the hand strength that this whole thing was built around? What happened to the ace kings, the ace queens, the ace jacks? Because that was basically our whole strategy leading up to this point. Now we get to a river where those hands got weaker, the whole strategy shuts down, right? And there's going to be some stuff in between, I'm sure. Maybe on like a lower spade, it's not going to be a full shutdown, but it's going to be a lot less aggressive. Maybe with the spade, it's a little bit more aggressive. Without, it's a little less aggressive, right? There's middle ground to this, but this is the most important thing to keep track of to figure out how your whole strategy is going to look, is how good are those polar common value hands we've been carrying with us this whole way, the ace kings, the ace queens, the ace jacks, how good are they on this river? And that's going to determine the betting strategy.
Right. So they got to be very, on a lot of boards, they're just not the best hand anymore. So I can hear, I see what you're saying. It's like ace jack, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. You do want to look at. So just that one card can take an ace jack from an all in to a check. And
Yeah. Yeah, on the queen, I think this hand was like a 60, no, it was like a 75% hand, 77% hand, like a very good value hand given the, given the stack to pot ratio. Um, and if you play around with these situations enough, you can start to get a sense for like how much equity do I need to be all in out of position? How much equity do I need to block bet? How much equity do I need to check? But really, like the most important part is just to be able to identify, are my value hands still good enough to be all in? Like otherwise I need to move away from that all in or check strategy,
Mhm.
and not get stuck in it. This is what I think happens to people, is they were like, oh, the whole plan was to set up stacks on the river, and now like that's what I'm supposed to do, right? I'm supposed to put stacks in. But you know, you have to pay attention to how the river changes things. And here it's quite easy to see that the flush card is what we're hoping to avoid. The flush card could really change things. There's not much else, I don't think, that could change it to this extreme. But it's really important to be able to play that river with your value range.
Well, let's go to their calling range, and then so we go all in, and we gotta think what to call with. I'm imagining top pair plus, and I guess what I usually look for here is just the threshold of value in terms of what I can call with, and then
Yeah.
I kind of have an idea of where I might go exploit. If I think they're really tight, then I'm just gonna start folding more strong hands, and if I think they're really loose, I might start calling with a bit wider range. So what I might look for here is like a blocker with a pair, with a king, with a queen, with a king and a 10, stuff like that. That's gonna reverse block some of their bluffs. Like I'm not gonna have cards that are gonna have their major bluffs, which are gonna be those lower cards. And then that's probably how I would think about this, is just kind of start with top pair and go down from there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the way to do it, because you're not always going to need to call more than top pair, and you're not even always going to need to call all your top pairs. Like on this river we're looking at, you can see that if we only called top pair plus, just kind of adding these percentages together, we just wouldn't really get there in terms of playing good defense. Like
Mhm.
we have 45, it looks like, percent of our range is top pair or better. So yeah, we got to start adding in a little more of those second pair or third pair bluff catchers. It really is just the ones you talked about, like the good tens with a blocker, the good queens with a blocker. And there's nothing
Mhm.
else super fancy that needs to happen. But if we look at the calling range, I know that I was just saying that on the spade, we don't really need to go all in, but you will face this. Like you'll face the all in, even on the spade. It's kind of important to recognize that, oh, like my range got pretty good on the spade. And I don't need to call top pair all the time. Like top pairs, not even necessarily in the top, 50% of my range anymore because I made so many flushes and I still had some two pairs and I still had some sets. So it's not always necessary to say, let's call all our top pairs and then figure out what else we need to add. It's kind of just like figuring out where's the top 50, in this situation, what's the top 50, 60% of our range, and put that together.
That's kind of how you think about it. You think about it in terms of like percentages, like where does this hand fall into my range? And I know that I have to call this amount, I have to call 60% here, or I have to call a certain percentage here in
On
order.
the river, yeah. On the
Yeah.
river, I think it works pretty well. And in heads up, where I trust people to find enough bluffs, I think it works pretty well. You were right to point out, like, not everyone's going to bluff enough. We don't always need to call the right number of hands. But
Mhm.
in a lot of heads up matches, people bluff. Like they bluff all the time. They usually bluff too much. I'm usually trying to play good defense on the river.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like the river, for the most part, facing a bet is generally like this setup's kind of straightforward in terms of maybe what you call with. And if you think they're over bluffing you, you call wider. And if you think they're under bluffing, you just fold tighter. So it's that turn, that pesky turn, or maybe checking here how to mix the frequencies, I think is the kind of deeper levels. And maybe we can save that for the next time we have our session. So I guess if you're a player out there and you want to practice some of this stuff, what kind of drills would you recommend they I know we got our trusted drills sheet. So
Yeah. So, this is the sheet that I sent you earlier. All of these are GTO Wizard built drills that you can make custom for heads up. I think from the section that we've talked about today, the most important thing to look at is what I called B33 turn barrel opportunity here, right? So that very first drill under the 3-bet pot offense section, this is really the turning point in the hand where you're moving from your relatively predefined, your relatively simple flop strategies to that polarized nature, figure out the rest of the hand, and really just making sure that you're getting your value thresholds right, like you talked about. It is going to involve a lot of checking. It is going to involve a lot of playing defense after you've checked. And even though we didn't cover that in great detail in the strategy of this video, like these are the spots that come up so often when you're playing 3-bet pots. So putting yourself in a drill where you're already at the turn and you have to do anything, you're already in that spot, you're going to play all the time, but you've just got to play the rest of the hand. That's the design that I think is going to have a pretty big impact on getting better quickly.
perfect. Yeah, I'll be working at that. I know for myself, because like I said, this is my main focus right now is this turn and river. And I think my biggest takeaway from this is when you talked about the idea of building a more polar versus linear strategy on earlier streets, knowing that you're going to be setting up that polarization strategy on a later street, and maybe just thinking about it from that framework of betting versus checking on all these different boards. And that way I can quickly build a strategy of sometimes I might want a quarter here. Sometimes if I want to go over bet, here's how I'm going to think about it. I'm going to go more polar now. And then on the turn, maybe the turn, I might go even linear. And then the river, I might, you know what I mean? I kind of like, I feel like there's a lot of ways to really work with that concept of what you described. So that's going to be my biggest takeaway. And the thing I'm going to be thinking about the most is just identifying those boards quickly post flop, and then understanding how to shift my range between the bet sizes. So that way I have a good idea of how I might want to split up and down the entire sizing tree, and then maybe how to apply that to the other side as well too when you're in position. So it's just going to be the thing I'm going to be working at for next time.
Nice.
Because last time I worked at reverse blocking the folding range and identifying that, and now that's really like transformed my game in terms of identifying bluffing opportunities from both positions as the aggressor and as the caller. So I think what you're describing now was like the next level of that framing.
Nice. Nice. I'm glad. Well, looking forward to the next one.
All right.
Sure,
Yeah. If
Joe.
anybody watched out there, yeah, let us know in the chat. Give us some comments. Give us some questions. And if we did the giveaway at the beginning, make sure that you get into it. We're going to make sure that we include you in something in the future. So, Kevin, you're the man as always. Appreciate the insight. Appreciate the time. And last time we did this, you won an event. So hopefully you have another big W here soon.
Appreciate that, Joey.
All right. See you guys later.